North Road made this.
Hello, I'm David Okeode, principal instructor at Kavis Cloud, 4 times Microsoft MVP, and author of multiple books on cloud security. I would like to speak with you about our courses at Kavis Cloud. First, we are cloud security focused. We maintain an unbiased stance towards vendors, and we cut through all the typical marketing jargon in many trainings out there. We help you to understand things as they really are. The second thing that's unique about our courses is that we are multi-cloud focused. Our multi-cloud security courses covers the top 3 public cloud platforms out there: AWS, Azure, and GCP. Our instructors are not just trainers, they are seasoned professionals with real-world experience. The third reason is that our training modules are designed to provide practical hands-on experience. Our courses are packed full of hands-on labs that you find engaging and interesting. And finally, our prices are the best out there. I encourage you to check out our upcoming courses on our website and also testimonials from our students. See you soon at www.kaviscloud.com. Hello everyone, hello and welcome to today's study series, today's Azure Security Study Series. So my name is David Okeode and I'll be taking you through a study session today. So last time I was here with my good friend Ibrahima and we're looking at the various aspects of Azure Security. So last time we talked about paying attention to identity security, paying attention to network security or the so-called perimeter security, paying attention to application security and data security. So those are what I'll consider to be like the key 4 pillars of Azure security. But before I get into that, just some quick information about some of the other things that we talked about already. So I'll go ahead and I'll share my screen and just very brief introduction, and then we'll get into today's study. So let's go. Yeah, there we go. And let's get the right amount of space on the screen. Yeah, that's better. So you already know David Akiade and Microsoft Azure MVP. Um, but also shared this before. If you're interested in learning about Azure security, I have quite a few books out there. All of them are available on Amazon.com. They're available on Pact.com or the Pact Publishers website. So we've got Pen Testing, Azure for Ethical Hackers, Azure Security, Azure Networking, and the latest one, which is on DevSecOps for Azure. So in case any of that catches your attention, please do check them out. So I've also mentioned this before in terms of like my engagement with the Azure community. But before I go any further, just some quick information. I will be showing some demonstrations as we go through this study series. And there is a lab environment that you find useful to have. It's a really basic lab environment. Essentially, you need a system that's connected to the internet. And if you're watching me today, you probably have that already locked down. But you also need access to an Azure subscription that has an Entra ID tenant associated with it. So preferably the Entra ID tenant should be um, one that has premium capabilities, because that's where you get like those security capabilities. That was part of like what we talked about last week. So Ibrahim and I, when we had that conversation on Entra ID, and you also need some test user account. So again, last week we said key aspect of cloud security or Azure cloud security is the four pillars of identity, network, application, and data. And there are many other aspects, but they tie into like this key four key pillars. And at the moment, we're focusing on sort of like the identity security piece. And last time where we stopped was we looked at the different authentication options that Azure supports. So Azure has authentication options that includes password authentication with Entra ID. As you can see on the screen, that's considered to be bad. At least it's bad if that's the only authentication option that you're using. Why? Um, it's very easy to guess password these days, right? So password guessing attacks, it's very easy to implement these days. So you have tools like there's a tool called the MSOL Spray tool. MSOL stands for Microsoft Online Spray. So it's a tool for doing a password spray attack against Microsoft Online environment, against Entra ID tenants. So passwords alone are bad. Many of you know that already. Something that's considered to be better than just using password is to use a second factor authentication, which Entra ID tenant supports using SMS or voice. So you can use any of those as your additional factors of authentication. And then we have better option. And the better option is where you're either using the Microsoft Authenticator with regards to the push notification. You're using a software one-time password one-time password token, or a hardware one-time password token. And even better than that is you're using passwordless authentication. And passwordless authentication is referring to methods that includes authenticator phone signing, but it also includes Microsoft Elo. So that's where you don't have to enter your password to authenticate. Many of you already use that on your Windows PC, where you can use your fingerprint to authenticate. You can use your face recognition to authenticate. So that unlocks a pin on your system, and that is used to essentially do authentication without you having to put in your password. You can also use a FIDO2 security key. I have mine over here. So I use one by Fashion. So I've got like my FIDO2 key here. So where you can implement. So, and I plug it in whenever I need to authenticate. It asks me to touch the key. I put my hands on the key. I can use that to authenticate. And you can also do certificate-based authentication. So if you have sort of like an enterprise certificate provider, you can tie that in and use that for authentication. That's considered to be the best. But I mentioned last week, or we mentioned last week in our conversation, that does not mean that it is without flaw. So be careful about that. And I referenced a research that was done. So by Dr. So Dr. Mulema, so is an amazing researcher when it comes to just Entra ID security and just Azure security in general. And one of his latest research has to do with one of his latest research has to do with abusing. So at DEFCON 32, has to do with abusing Windows Hello to essentially get access to a primary refresh token. And for those of you that know what the primary refresh token can do, what that means is that you can use that to mint your own access tokens to access the rest of the environment if you can get your hand on a primary refresh token. So because we say it's the best doesn't mean that it's without flaws. So that's one of the reasons why in security, we always have to have multiple layers of defense when we're talking about implementing that. So I'll put the link to Deggen's research. I'll put that in the chat window. So do check that out when you have the chance. So let's move on here very quickly. So we mentioned that when it comes to authentication method, it's getting a balance between convenience, something that does not impact on productivity, and security. So it's getting that balance right between convenience and security. It can get to a point where security can impact on productivity. I've seen that some organizations, for example, their answer or their response to the latest wave of generative AI is to block that. So they're gonna block the users from using generative AI completely. That's their response to that. Now, at the back of their mind, what they're looking at is high security. But that is impacting on the users in terms of not just convenience, but in terms of their productivity. So what we typically see in those kind of environments is that users copy corporate data out of the corporate laptop, desktop environment and put it on their own personal devices just so they can use ChatGPT or generative AI, right? So it's sort of like getting that balance between high security and convenience. What I've also seen some other organizations do, which I think is a great way to do it, is they've provided a self-hosted LLM platforms or self-hosted generative AI portals for their organizations, because some of these LLMs, you can host them within your own environment. For example, Azure supports Azure OpenAI. So, but then making that available internally within your organization so that users can use that in a more secure way. So instead of going with, let's just block everything down. But what I'm trying to say is that this is the same challenge when it comes to authentication, is getting that balance right between high security and convenience or productivity. So which is where passwordless can help to sort of like be a good balance between both. Because a passwordless, again, if I want to authenticate, I sit in front of my computer, I do my fingerprint, and that's it. If I'm prompted to re-authenticate, I just have to swipe my fingerprint again, and then I'm re-authenticated. I don't have to be typing in the password like every now and then. So it gets that sort of like balance between both. So I showed this to you like last time, but I'm just going to bring it up again. So if I go over to like my Azure environment, if I go to my Entra ID tenant, and under the security section, that is where I can enable or disable certain authentication methods. So on the security section, on the authentication methods, under the manage section, I can see the different authentication options that are available, and I can configure them. For example, I can click on the FIDO tool, and I can enable that for a certain users in my environment. So instead of enabling it for all the users, I can target certain groups. And by the way, that is a good process when you're rolling this out. When you're rolling this out, you don't just want to enable it for all users. Especially, you have to be careful not to lock yourself out. So you may want to target like certain groups of users to test what the process looks like, fine-tune what the process looks like, document what the process looks like before rolling that out across your environment. So yeah, some good practices when it comes to this. By the way, this is what the flow or the process looks like for MFA. So user goes to authenticate to their cloud application. They get redirected to Entra ID as the identity provider. Entra ID essentially calls Cloud MFA, which the user can authenticate using any of the methods that's been enabled for the user and that has been registered for the user. The user has not registered, they can be prompted to register, to do the registration for whichever MFA method that you've enabled. You can also, that's also something that we have control over in terms of specifying the registration policies for users in our organization. For example, under here, we can run a registration campaign where we can prompt users to register, for example, for their Microsoft Authenticator. I can go edit that and I can go set up like an authentication campaign and target certain users and groups in my organization and essentially force them or prompt them to register their OAuth2 tokens, their mobile phone authenticator, or whatever I need to do. So I can run registration campaigns. And if I want to see gaps in my environment, if I want to see gaps in terms of who's yet to be enabled for MFA in my environment. So if I go to under, not under authentication strengths, let's go to under my registration cap. Actually, let's go to under monitoring. So under monitoring, if I go to under user registration details, oh, okay. This is one of those things. So that's why I said in your lab, you probably want to have Microsoft Entra Premium. I do have Microsoft Entra Premium, but it's expired. So I need to figure out another way to do this. But anyways, if you go under the user registration details, that's where you can see what's your MFA posture. What does that look like? How many users have registered their devices? How many users are yet to register their devices? How many users have registered passwordless or just other form of weaker type MFA? So that's where you can see that information in your environment. And once MFA is completed, that gets the user, the client that made the call to be issued an access token and a refresh token. We'll talk about the tokens later, and we'll talk about token protection later. Maybe not today, but in this series, we'll talk about that. And then the access token in particular can be presented to the cloud application to access the cloud application. Good practices when it comes to MFA, register multiple methods. Why? For resilience purposes. Without MFA, once you have that implemented or rolled out across your environment, without MFA, users may not be able to authenticate. So having multiple options is great. So for example, let's say there is a phone provider that has an issue and users are not able to receive their SMS, right? Or maybe they're not able to receive their phone calls. They can still authenticate using another MFA method, if that makes sense. So always have multiple methods enabled. That's for resiliency. Resiliency is a key part of security that many people can ignore, right? So if an attacker knows that you only have, you're reliant on a single form of MFA, that could be an area to target to deny users from being able to use that, the particular service. Number two is you want to be careful about this. You want to have a policy to make sure that people cannot register their MFA devices except they're doing that from a trusted location. Why is that important? Why that is important is because of a registration hijack attack. A registration hijack attack. And a registration hijack attack means an attacker has the user's username and password, and they register a separate device. So they can essentially do MFA on behalf of the user, of the original user. So for example, I've been able to compromise your username and password. I register, an OAuth token, an OAuth key on your account. So whenever signing with your username and password is asked for MFA, I just do the MFA without needing to do anything to either phish the user or try to, like, let's say, do MFA bombard attack against the user, other types of stuff. So this way I can say you can only register your MFA device from your corporate device or from your corporate laptop, because your corporate laptop is joined to the domain, or maybe your corporate laptop is connected via VPN to the corporate network. So that acts as additional forms of authentication to make sure that the user that's registering this MFA device is the actual user, because they have access to a corporate laptop and they're connecting through the corporate VPN. So that you can do using conditional access policy, which we'll talk about later. Another good practice is enable or configure registration campaign. So I talked about this earlier. So make sure you always identify, where are the MFA gaps in my environment? Do I have users that are yet to register their MFA methods? Identify the gaps and then target registration campaigns at those users so they can register, make sure that you have coverage in those areas. The other thing that you want to do is you want to address MFA for emergency accounts. What are emergency accounts? Those are the 2 admin accounts that Microsoft recommends in their documentation, and they say you exclude those from typical, like, security policies or some certain types of security policies, in case you make a tenant-wide mistake where you need to roll things back. He said, David, this never happens. This actually happened before. Like it's happened in some of the things areas that I've seen. So I've seen situations where an organization, for example, reached out to me and said, David, can you help us? Use your MVP, use your MVP influence to try to see if Microsoft can escalate this for us. So because there was a change that was made, and now everyone is locked out of the environment because no one can do MFA, and everyone, including the CEO of the company, can log in. So because we accidentally rolled out a policy that locked everyone out. So in that case, what you do is typically you have 2 admin accounts, which are also referred to as the break glass accounts. And then what you do is that you exclude them from MFA. They'll have very strong password, and then you can use those to roll back the change that you made. However, Microsoft's new policy is that going forward, any account that needs to log into Azure management interfaces, that includes Azure Portal, that includes Microsoft Intune, that includes Azure PowerShell, Azure CLI, any account that needs to log into any Azure management interface will be required to do MFA, including your break glass accounts. And what that means is that you now have to make sure that you have MFA enabled for your break glass account going forward. David, what is the best MFA method to enable for my break glass account? I'm not going to give you the answer for that. Instead, I'll refer you to the answer that was written by someone who works at Microsoft as a product manager, the Microsoft Identity Team as a product manager. So let me, some of you may know him, his name is Merrill. So Merrill put out very good content when it comes to Microsoft Identity. If you're not following his blog, I highly recommend that you follow his blog. But let me bring up Merrill's recommendation around this. So let me see if I have this somewhere, which I do not have here. But anyways, I'll find the link. Let me look for Merrill's link. 1 minute. I think it will be easy for me to find. So Merrill Fernando. And yeah, I think I found it already. There we go. So this is Merrill's recommendation. So you say, as part of Azure MFA enforcement rollout, emergency accounts will now need to be registered for MFA. And essentially, the recommended MFA methods is using certificate-based authentication, Windows Hello for Business, FIDO2 security keys. And the main reason for that is because these three MFA options don't have reliance on another service. So, for example, SMS has reliance on the phone provider service, or voice call has reliance on the phone provider service. These are accounts that you're using for your resilience in case you need to roll things back in an emergency. So, you want to make sure that the MFA method that you've enabled for them does not rely on another service, which could in turn be unavailable, right? So, that's one of the reasons why, that's the recommendation. So, I'll put this link in the chat window in case anyone needs to. Please do check them out. Check out the recommendations. I'll put that in the chat window. Okay, so let's move on very quickly. If you have any questions, put your questions in the chat window. Let's talk about this Microsoft Entra Verified ID. Microsoft Entra is a suite of products, is a suite of solutions, right, that deals with identity and access security. Microsoft Entra ID is one of the solutions within the Microsoft Entra suite, and that is for identity and access for cloud services and on-premise services that are connected to the application proxy and those types of use cases. However, there is another solution that's part of the Microsoft Entra suite, which is called the Microsoft Entra Verified ID, which very few people that I've seen have actually implemented this or used this. But what is this service about? What is Microsoft Entra Verified ID? Here is what it's about. It's about it's what you call a digital identity verification service. David, what does that mean? Think about it as your digital passport or as a digital passport issuer, right? Or think about it as, let's say, a digital driver's license issuer. What does that mean? Again, I mentioned something earlier. I said it's a centralized, actually I have it here. So it's a centralized digital identity verification service. Centralized digital identity verification service. So imagine, like, let's say you go into, like your local store and you're going to get like alcohol or something, right? And they ask you, well, we need to know that you're above the required age before we can sell these products to you. So you have to verify your identity, right, in the real world. So what do? You bring out your driver's license or you bring out your passport and you show it to them. And they have a look at this, They may look at certain aspects or certain attributes of that ID to make sure that it's authentic, it's not fake. And then once they look at it, they're like, okay, yeah, it's a real passport, and it says on there that you're 25 years old. So you're more than so you're more than the required age that we can sell this product to. So they sell that to you. That is a centralized identity service in the real world, right? So instead of everyone having to validate your identity individually. So imagine like you go again to like your local grocery store, you want to buy some alcohol, and then they say to you, well, we need to do some blood tests to verify that you're actually above 18 years old. We need to, they can't do that every single time. You just centralize that, and then you can present that identity. You can present that identifier anytime you need to verify your identity. That is what this provides. So, David, what is the use case for something like this? Well, the use case for something like this is massive, right? For example, you want to do work with like banking and financial services. And maybe they have certain requirements to verify things relating to like a user's age or other types of stuff. Maybe you want to apply for a credit card loan. They need to verify your age and other stuff. Instead of you having to go through a separate verification process with the banking and financial services, you can just present your digital identity, your verified ID to them, and they use that to verify you. Maybe you want to consume some government services, And some of you have seen that. Maybe in your government services, you're applying, filing your taxes online, you're applying for, or maybe you're renewing your driver's license or your passport. You go through a verification process. But instead of you having to go through a verification process 15 different times whenever you need to access banking and financial services, government services, healthcare services, employment, online education, you have to go through individual validation of your digital identity using all these providers. You just have a centralized digital identity provider that verifies you, and then you can reuse that verified identity every single time. So this saves you, right? This saves the organization. It saves you having to go through like all these added like overload. So hopefully that makes sense to you. That is what this service is about in terms of digital ID, in terms of Microsoft Entra verified ID. There are different aspects to this, to making this work. So let me see if I can go to this. Let me go over and see if I can show you like some demonstration around this very quickly. So let's go to the portal. So what I'll do is I'll bring up the Entra ID tenants. Let's see, I've got my Entra ID tenant and should be able to show you some demonstrations around this. So very quickly, I'll bring these up. So let's go to entra.microsoft.com. Got it? So, but my concern here is I might have, I hope I've got the right license to be able to show this to you, but we'll see. So anyways, one of the key things that I can do here is if I go to on the verified ID, and if I go to under organization settings, okay, let's go to under overview. There is a way to do like a quick start. So if you want to, depending on the type of, depending on the type of customization that you want, you can just do like a quick start. So or a very quick setup option, or you can go for something that where you can customize the provider and customize how that should be set up. In this case, if I click on configure organization name, I'll just call this Cavis Cloud Tests. And trusted domain name, I'll need to put in a domain name that I actually own. So in this case, I'll put in https www.caviscloud.com. So in this case, I need to go through like a process to verify my domain. So if you go to like the documentation on what you need to do to verify your domain, you may need to go add certain files to that domain provider so that Microsoft can verify that. And then you need to create a key vault resource that you need to, that Microsoft can use to store the private key pair that's going to be used for this. And then once you've configured that, then you can go through the other process of registering your decentralized ID. So this is where I'll need to download this documents, and then I'll need to go to my service, and then I'll need to go host this file in that location, because Microsoft would need to verify that I own that domain. So essentially this like creating a trust relationship between this digital identity provider and my domain. So I won't be doing that now because it takes a while to do that. Once I've hosted that file on my domain, I come back here, I refresh, I verify, Microsoft checks it out, make sure that that file exists, and then that trust relationship is established. All right, and then I go through the process of verifying my domain ownership. And then once that is done, I can start issuing credentials. I can start issuing ID to users, and then that can now be reused to validate their credential. So I'll show you like a much more deeper demo of this one, but maybe we'll come back to that later. But I just wanted to bring that out and point that out. Okay, I'm looking at the time here, so let's move on quickly. So let's talk about this. whenever we talk about things like identity security, one of the aspects that you see come up is around zero trust security or zero trust. What that is referring to is a security model. It's not a product, it's not a marketing terminology, it's a security model. It's a security model that says in a decentralized world where services that we're using in our day-to-day work is not hosted within our network, it's hosted in other people's network like software as a service. The best way to handle or tackle security is to adjust the model, to shift our model from a perimeter focused security to a different type of model, which is again called the zero trust model. And again, if you're looking at Microsoft documentation, Microsoft will tell you there are three key principles or three guiding principles of zero trust security. They'll say principle number one is you have to verify explicitly, is what they will say as principle number one, verify explicitly. In other words, you can't just grant access only you can't just do like an implicit trust and say, oh, if this request is coming from within our corporate network, it can be trusted. You can't just do that. You have to verify every single request using every data point that you can get, right? To do like your security validation. And again, this is a conceptual thing. In practice, we see what that looks like. But that's one of the guiding principles is verify explicitly. The other guiding principle that I will say is use least privilege. Least privilege means don't grant unnecessary access. And the main reason for that is number three, guiding principle, which is assume that there's going to be a breach. Listen to me, ladies and gentlemen. You have organizations out there that are spending millions and billions hiring top security professionals. And those organizations are still getting breached. Security is not like a zero-sum everything like, oh, it's either like you're 100% secure. There's nothing like 100% security. I remember like in college, I got into trouble in one of my papers where I accidentally made that statement of 100% security. And I remember the professor that was grading my paper looked at it and said, what do you mean by 100% security? It's nothing called 100% security, right? It does not exist. So assume that you'll be breached. Many people say, no, I'm a security professional. Listen, I shared something with you last time with Ibrahima, right? The 10 guiding principles, principles of cybersecurity. I shared that with you. It's like a Microsoft document from years ago. Yeah, 10 immutable laws of security. And again, I'll bring that up. It's a really good guiding process, right? No one, right? It says security can achieve a perfect secure state, right? So they mentioned that security can't achieve a perfect secure state. So keep that in mind. But it's one of the things that he says where he says something. I think it's around, no one thinks that they will get breached until they get breached, right? So I'm not sure whether it's like in this document. Again, I'll put this link in the chat window for anyone that may want to refer to it. But yeah, no one thinks that they will get breached until they get breached. So why don't we go into security at the back of our mind to go, okay, let's be clear. We're going to be breached at some point in time. What should we have in place when that happens? And if you go in with that approach, you find out that you design a better secure architecture than if you go in with the approach of, don't worry, we're going to block everything. Go in with the approach of, no, we can't block everything. And therefore, we need to be prepared for how to mitigate a successful attack when we get breached. So, and that is one of the reasons why don't grant privileges that people do not need. Because when you do that, you're creating opportunity for lateral movement if that identity gets compromised. Again, we're getting ahead of ourselves here. Let's talk about some of the stuff. What are some of the things that we can begin to implement in securing identity? Apart from MFA that we've talked about before, we have password protection capabilities. Password protection capabilities, what does that mean? So that is a way for us to protect passwords in Entra ID. And there are three key features, and this is where I'll stop for today. There are three key features in password protection. We can implement a global banned password list. We can implement a custom banned password list, and we can integrate password protection with on-premises. What is the use case of password protection? Many organizations, when it comes to password security, what they will do is they'll say you have to have a strong password. And by strong passwords, they have password complexity requirements. So they'll set a password complexity level. You have to have, one capital word. You have to have certain special characters and all of that stuff. But what you find out if you have a look at the list of the most vulnerable passwords is that many of them actually meet password complexity requirements. I mean, you have passwords like capital P, A, dollar, dollar, W, 0, D, 1 or whatever you put at the end and stuff like that. That password meets a lot of password complexity requirements. But is that a good password? No, it's not a good password. You may have a default password that comes with many systems, which meet password complexity requirement, but it's still vulnerable because it's a common password. It is well known to the attackers. So what you may want to do is you may want to have and say, apart from password complexity requirements, I also have a list of passwords that I know that are vulnerable that I don't want users in my organizations to use. So like in the UK, there is the NCSC. The NCSC publishes a list of like the top vulnerable passwords. So I think it's like 100,000 list. So I'll share that link with you again. So let me bring up the link. So it's from the ncsc.gov.uk website. So here is a list of certain passwords that are the most like 100,000 vulnerable password. Attackers have this list, by the way, right? They have a list of all of these vulnerable passwords, and you may probably want to block users in your organization from being able to use them, whether or not they meet password complexity requirements or not. That is what password protection allows us to do. So we can implement so Microsoft themselves have a global banned password list where they look at some of the common password and they will stop your users from using them. You can set a custom banned password list, but yeah, you can integrate this with on-premises. So let's look at how that works. So you have a global banned password list, which is a list that's compiled by Microsoft that will be blocked from users using that in your environment. You can set your own custom banned password list. But then the other good thing about it is that whenever there's a password set or reset operation by your user, it goes through that filter. If the password that you're trying to set is on this list, either the list from Microsoft or your own custom list, then it's not going to allow them to set it. If it's not on that list, then it's going to allow them to set that password. So that is password protection in a nutshell. So I think that I'll probably just, let's just see like one more stuff with regards to how the integration with on-premises works. So here's how the integration with on-premises works. In Entra ID, you have your global banned password list or your custom banned password list. And by the way, let me show you where you can configure that here. So let's go back to Entra ID. And if I go back to under security, and if I go to let's see, so go Entra ID security, and if I go to let's go back here, and yeah, let's go back to under security, and under security, if I go to not this one, 1 minute, let me go back to my slides and let's go to the other one. I think I should have configuration place. Yeah, so it's under authentication method. Sorry, that was why I was missing it. So under authentication methods, there we go. And then under authentication methods, you have password protection. So, and we'll talk about smart lockout later, but if you have the right license, which you need the Entra ID premium license to configure that, if you have the right license, this is where you can specify your custom banned password list. And one of the good things about it is that you don't need to specify odd variants. For example, if I specify the name, Caris Cloud, and say, I don't want people using the name of my organization as the password. If I specify the name Caris Cloud, on my custom banned password list, is going to automatically block all the different uses. So if a user tries to use Caris Cloud, but maybe what they're trying to do is they will replace the O with a 0, it's not going to allow them to do that. So it's going to look at all the different ways that users will try to modify this a little bit. And it knows that attackers will try to do that also. So it's going to go, you're blocking Caris Cloud. If a user tries to take out the O and put a 0 in, it's still not going to allow that. So, but you're only going to specify it once, right? So anyways, once you have your list, let's go back to the next slide. Then what you want is that you're going to have a server on premises. And that server on premises, you're going to install the Entra ID password protection domain controller agent. You install that on your domain controller. Then you have to set up the Entra ID password protection service. You set that up on a member server that you have on premises. And again, once you have like this agent, what that's going to do is that frequently it's going to use the proxy to go out to Entra ID and download this list of the banned password list, but from Microsoft, and the one that your own custom list is going to download it locally, so that when users on premises are trying to do a password set operation, if they're trying to use any password that's on that list, it's going to either allow or block it if it's on that list. So that is how that works in a nutshell. So you just need to make sure that you have the agent installed. So when you go to password protection for Windows Server, once you set that yes, you can download the agent and you can set it up on premises. So ladies and gentlemen, that's where we'll stop for today's study series. I hope that you got some useful information. If you have any questions, you can put it in the chat window. I'll be happy to answer. Otherwise, that will be the end of our study today, and we'll pick it up from there next week. And also, if there's any specific aspects that you'd like me to touch on later in this series, again, I'm trying to cover identity security for Azure, network security for Azure, application security for Azure, and data security for Azure. So I want to cover those 4 different aspects in this series. So if there's any specific areas that you want me to dig into, do let me know. Someone has already reached out regarding tokens. So in the series on identity security, I'll do a whole session where I talk about token security in Azure for things like your refresh token, your primary refresh token, your access token, how they can be abused, and how you can protect them. So any questions? If there are no questions, that will be where we'll stop for today. Thanks very much for joining me today. So hope to see you next time. Have a lovely rest of the morning, afternoon, evening, wherever you're joining from, and see you later. Bye for now, everyone.